I was pulling the last of the green beans from the garden when my phone rang. It was my son-in-law. His voice was strange, too flat, too careful. He said my daughter had been in an accident. He said she was at St. Vincent's. He said I shouldn't worry. I was in my car before he finished the sentence. I have driven that road to the hospital 100 times in 63 years, past the Lutheran church where I got married, past the grain elevator my father used to stop at when I was small, past the turn that leads to the lake house where my daughter learned to swim. I didn't see any of it that afternoon. My hands were on the wheel and my eyes were on the road, and my mind was somewhere else entirely, bargaining with God the way you do when you're terrified and there's nothing else left to do. She was in a room at the end of a long hallway. Her face was swollen on the left side. Her right wrist was in a brace. There was a cut above her eye, held together with 3 small stitches, and she was watching the door when I walked in, the way a person watches a door when they're not sure who's going to come through it. When she saw me, she started to cry. I sat on the edge of the bed and held her hand, the good one, and waited. I've learned over 63 years that sometimes you have to just wait. My daughter has always needed a minute to find the words. When she was 7 and broke the kitchen window, she stood there for a full 5 minutes before she could explain what happened. Some things don't change. She said she had slipped on the back porch steps. I looked at her face. I looked at her wrist. I looked at the way she wouldn't quite meet my eyes when she said it. I said, "Sweetheart, the back porch steps are rubber grip. Your father put those in himself 15 years ago." She didn't say anything. I waited some more. Then she leaned toward me, just a little, and she whispered, so quiet I had to tilt my head toward her, "Mom." It was Darlene. She said I had no right to call myself part of their family. She said I never would. Darlene, my son-in-law's mother. The woman who had sat at my Thanksgiving table 4 years in a row eating my sweet potato casserole and telling me how lovely my home was. I kept my face very still. I've had a lot of practice keeping my face still. I squeezed my daughter's hand and I said, "All right, tell me everything." My daughter's name is Willa. She is 37 years old. She teaches 3rd grade at an elementary school about 2 miles from the house she shares with her husband. And she has the kind of patience with other people's children that I suspect she learned partly from me and partly just from being born the way she is. Gentle to her core, the kind of person who apologizes when someone else bumps into her. She married her husband, whose name is Preston, 6 years ago. The wedding was at a vineyard outside of town, on a Saturday in October when the leaves were at their peak, and the whole world looked like it had been painted by someone in a very good mood. I danced with my brother at that reception until my feet hurt, and I remember thinking that I hadn't been that happy since the year Willa was born. Preston is a good man. I want to be clear about that, because none of what follows is really about Preston. He loves my daughter. I have watched him love her for 6 years, and I have never doubted it for a single day. He is a large, quiet man who fixes things around the house without being asked, and brings Willa soup when she's sick, and coaches Little League on weekends, even though they don't have children yet. He's the kind of man my late husband would have respected. His mother, Darlene, is another matter. I noticed it at the wedding, actually. Not anything I could have put into words then, just a quality in the way Darlene looked at Willa sometimes. A quick, downward assessment, a smile that didn't always reach her eyes. I told myself I was being a protective mother. I told myself I was looking for problems because I'd spent 37 years looking out for my daughter, and old habits die hard. I was right the first time. Willa didn't tell me much over the years. She's not a complainer. I would hear things in pieces. A comment Darlene made at Christmas about the way Willa decorated the house. A remark at Easter about how women who worked full-time couldn't be expected to keep things as tidy as women who stayed home. Little things. The kind of things that are hard to call out directly because each one alone sounds almost reasonable. But together they build into something that isn't reasonable at all. They build into a message. And the message is, you are not good enough, and you never will be. But this was not a comment about housekeeping. Willa told me what happened in pieces, the way she always tells difficult things. I put it together slowly, sitting in that hospital room while the afternoon light moved across the floor, and a nurse came in twice to check the monitors. Darlene had come to the house unannounced that morning. Preston was at work. Willa was home because her school had a professional development day. Darlene had a key. Preston had given her 1 year ago before they were married, when he was living there alone, and the key had never been reclaimed. She walked in. Willa was in the kitchen making coffee. Willa said Darlene was different from the moment she came through the door, wound up in a way Willa hadn't seen before. She'd been going through Preston's desk. They had recently updated their estate documents, named each other as beneficiaries, the ordinary business of being married adults. And Darlene had found a copy of the new will. She had found that her son had provided for his wife, and something about that had broken something loose in her. Willa told me Darlene said things she won't fully repeat. Said that Willa had manipulated her son. Said that Willa's family, meaning me, meaning my brother, meaning everyone Willa came from, had never had anything and would use Preston to get what they wanted. Said that a woman like Willa didn't belong in that house or in that family, and that if she had any decency, she would step aside and let Preston have a real life. Willa said she tried to walk away, said she moved toward the back door to get some air, to put some space between herself and the words. Darlene grabbed her arm. Willa pulled free, lost her footing on the threshold, went down on the porch steps, the 3 steps that lead to the small yard where Preston grows tomatoes in summer. She put her hand out to catch herself. That's the wrist. Her face hit the iron railing on the way down. That's the stitches. Darlene, according to Willa, stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she said, "You should be more careful," and she left. Willa lay on those steps for a little while. Then she got herself up, got herself inside, and called her husband. Preston called me. I sat in that hospital room and I held my daughter's hand and I kept my face very still, the way I've learned to do, and I thought about Darlene's smile at the wedding. I thought about 6 years of small comments. I thought about my daughter lying on 3 wooden steps in a backyard alone. Then I called my brother. My brother's name is Clifton. He is 68 years old, 4 years older than me, and he spent 30 years as a detective with the county sheriff's office before he retired to raise chickens and grow things in his garden and involve himself in local politics in the way that men like him always do when they finally stop working, loudly and with great conviction. He is the person I call when something is wrong. He has always been the person I call when something is wrong, since we were children and I was the one who could never figure out what to do next. I told him what Willa told me. There was a long silence on the phone. Then he said, "I'm on my way." He was at the hospital within the hour. He sat in the chair by the window and he listened to Willa tell it again, the whole thing. And he asked her questions, gentle questions, the kind he learned to ask over 30 years of talking to people who were scared or hurt or didn't want to say the thing they needed to say. He asked about the timeline. He asked about the key. He asked whether there were any security cameras in the neighborhood, whether anyone might have seen Darlene arrive or leave. Willa looked at him a little surprised. She said she didn't know about cameras. Clifton said that was fine, that he'd find out. Preston arrived around 6. He came through the door, looking like a man who had been hit by something he hadn't seen coming, which is exactly what had happened to him. He sat on the bed next to Willa, and he held her face carefully in his hands and looked at the stitches and the swelling. And he didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know." Willa said she knew he didn't know. I believed her and I believed him, and I also knew that sorry was not going to be enough. Not this time. What Darlene had done was not a misunderstanding. It was not a personality clash or a family disagreement or a difficult mother-in-law saying something she shouldn't have said. A woman had come into my daughter's home uninvited, said things designed to diminish and destroy her, and then left her lying hurt on the back steps and walked away. That is not something you apologize your way out of. I told Preston that. I told him clearly and without any particular emotion, because I find that the absence of emotion is often more effective than the presence of it when you need someone to hear you. I told him that I loved him as a son, that I had always loved him as a son, and that what happened was going to have consequences for his mother that I could not help him prevent. Preston said he understood. I believed that too. Clifton went to work the way Clifton always goes to work, methodically, without drama. with the patience of someone who has spent 30 years learning that the truth almost always surfaces if you are willing to do the boring work of looking for it. The neighbor 2 houses down had a doorbell camera. It had captured Darlene's car arriving at 8:47 in the morning. It had captured Darlene leaving at 10:12. It had captured at 9:58 the moment when my daughter appeared at the back corner of the house, clearly unsteady, one hand pressed against the siding, making her way toward the front. That was 14 minutes before Darlene left. Let that sit for a moment. 14 minutes. My daughter, injured, working her way around the outside of her own house, and Darlene sitting inside for 14 more minutes before deciding to go. Clifton also talked to Willa's next-door neighbor, a retired nurse named Georgette, who is the kind of woman who pays attention to things. Georgette had been pulling weeds in her front yard that morning. She had seen Darlene arrive. She had heard raised voices through the open kitchen window. She said she could not make out words, but she could make out tone, and the tone was not a conversation. She had seen Darlene leave. She had seen the expression on Darlene's face when she walked to her car. Georgette said she'd be willing to say all of that to anyone who needed to hear it. Clifton brought all of this to Willa and Preston. He laid it out plainly, what existed, what it showed, what it meant. He said that what Darlene had done met the standard for criminal charges. He said that was Willa's decision to make, and that he would support whatever she decided, and that he wanted her to make it without feeling pressure from anyone in any direction. Willa looked at Preston. Preston said, "Whatever you need." There was a long moment. I watched my daughter's face. I watched her do the thing she has always done, weigh other people's feelings, consider the cost to everyone around her, think about what is kind before she thinks about what is right. I watched her almost talk herself out of it. Then she thought about lying on those steps. You could see it cross her face, the memory of it. She said, "I want to file the report." Darlene was not expecting it. That much was clear from the way her attorney called Preston's cell phone 3 times in the 24 hours after the police made contact with her. The message, filtered through Preston to us, was that Darlene wanted to apologize, that she recognized she had made a terrible mistake, that she was under enormous stress and had not been herself, and she hoped that family could work through this privately. Family. The word landed in my chest like something small and cold. 6 years of small comments. 6 years of my daughter absorbing things she shouldn't have had to absorb, adjusting herself to fit a space that was never meant to include her, smiling at a woman who smiled back without meaning it. 6 years of being gracious to someone who was counting on her graciousness to go unchallenged. I thought about what Clifton always says, which is that the people who want to resolve things privately are usually the people who know exactly what the evidence shows. We did not resolve it privately. The charges were filed. Willa gave her statement. Georgette gave hers. The footage from the doorbell camera was submitted. Darlene's attorney managed to negotiate it down to a misdemeanor battery charge and a civil harassment finding, which meant no prison time but a substantial fine, a restraining order keeping Darlene 1,000 feet from Willa, from our home, from Willa's school, and a formal record that would follow her for a long time. It was not everything. It was not nothing. What it was actually was enough. I want to tell you about the week after because I think it matters. Preston sat at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon while Willa rested upstairs, and he drank 3 cups of my coffee, and he talked. He talked about growing up with Darlene, about how her love had always had conditions attached to it, that he'd learned to meet so automatically he'd stopped noticing the conditions, about how he'd told himself his mother was just particular, just traditional, just hard to warm up to. He talked about the will, how he'd sat down with the estate attorney and made all those completely ordinary decisions about his life and his wife and their future together, and felt good about it, felt like an adult taking care of his family, and had not once thought about how his mother might react to finding out that his wife was his family now. He said, "I didn't protect her." I told him he couldn't protect her from something he didn't see coming. He said, "I should have seen it coming." He wasn't wrong about that, and I didn't tell him he was wrong because I think he needed to sit with it for a while. Sitting with the things we should have seen sooner is how we learn to see them sooner next time. I know that from 63 years of my own mistakes. But I also told him that what he did after mattered, that he had stood next to his wife, clearly and without hesitation, and that Willa knew it, and I knew it, and it was not a small thing. He nodded. He drank his coffee. He looked out my kitchen window at the garden where I'd been pulling green beans when all of this started. He said, "She loves your garden. She always talks about it." I said I knew. I said I was going to teach her to put it up this fall, jam and preserves and pickled beans and all of it. Things my mother taught me and her mother taught her, things that get handed down. He smiled at that. First time I'd seen him smile in about a week. Willa's wrist healed in 6 weeks. The bruising on her face faded faster than I expected. She has always healed quickly, since she was a child. She went back to her classroom and 3rd graders made her a card with 31 separate drawings on it, each one a different interpretation of what her teacher looked like, which ranged from fairly accurate to deeply abstract. And she brought it over to show me and we laughed at it for a good 15 minutes. She seems, against all odds, lighter. That is the word I keep coming back to. Like something that had been pressing down on her for a long time has been lifted. Like she can breathe in a way she maybe hadn't realized she wasn't breathing. I've thought a lot about that. About the weight of accommodating people who have already decided not to accept you. About how much energy it takes to keep adjusting yourself, softening your edges, making yourself smaller, hoping that eventually the work you're putting in will be rewarded with the belonging you deserve. About how that weight is so gradual, so constant, that you stop feeling it as weight. You just feel it as the normal heaviness of being alive, until it's gone. Clifton came to dinner on a Friday in November, the first cold night of the year, and I made pot roast, and he brought a bottle of red wine. And Preston and Willa sat across from us, and we ate and talked about nothing important. About Clifton's chickens and the local ballot measure he was worked up about, and a movie Willa and Preston had seen the week before. At some point late in the evening, when the pot roast was long finished and we were all just sitting there in the warm kitchen with our wine, my daughter looked at me across the table, and she smiled in a way I haven't seen her smile in a long time. Full. That's what it looked like. Full. Clifton noticed it too. He caught my eye over his wine glass and gave me a small nod, the kind of nod that means, yes, I see it, and yes, this is what we were working toward. There was a quilt on the back of my living room couch that belonged to my mother and her mother before her. It has been repaired many times. You can see the different threads if you look closely, places where something wore thin and someone added new material to hold it together. My mother used to say that the repaired parts were the strongest parts because they had been made twice. I think about Willa when I look at that quilt now, about the thing that happened to her and the fact that she is still here, still whole, still able to laugh at drawings made by 8-year-olds, about the way the people who love her came around her, and the way that holding has become part of her now, woven in, made twice, stronger for it. That Friday night, after Clifton left and Preston was loading dishes into the dishwasher, Willa sat down next to me on the couch and leaned against my shoulder the way she did when she was small and had a bad day at school. I put my arm around her. Outside the window, the first real cold front of winter was coming through, the kind that strips the last leaves off the trees and reminds you that the bare branches are not the end of anything, just the quiet before the next beginning. She said, "Thank you, Mom." I said, "Always." And I meant it the way you mean things when you have 63 years behind you and you know exactly how much they cost and exactly what they're worth. I meant it completely. I keep coming back to that quilt on the back of the couch, the one my mother patched and her mother patched before her, the one where you can see every repair if you look closely enough. I used to think the repairs were the sad parts, evidence of something that broke. I don't think that anymore. What happened to Willa didn't come out of nowhere. That's the thing I've had to sit with. Darlene didn't walk through that door one morning and become someone different. She had been building toward it for 6 years, one small cruelty at a time, and we had all been too careful, too polite, too willing to interpret the worst of her behavior as something more innocent than it was. There are consequences to that kind of willful blindness, not just the consequences that come at the end, when something finally breaks open, but the quieter ones that accumulate in the middle. The way Willa had learned to make herself smaller, The way she second-guessed her own instincts, the weight of it that she'd stopped feeling as weight. I think about what it took for my daughter to say, finally, I want to file the report. She had every reason not to. She had a husband who loved his mother despite everything. She had years of practice swallowing hard things. She had that deep, trained instinct to keep the peace. But she sat in that hospital room and she made the harder choice, the one that cost more in the short run and meant more in the long run. And I believe that choice came from something she'd been building her whole life without always knowing she was building it. Clifton didn't come to that hospital room with noise or anger. He came with patience and method and 30 years of knowing that the truth requires work to surface. He asked the right questions. He found Georgette. He found the footage. He laid it out plainly, and then he stepped back and let Willa decide. That kind of clarity, knowing what you know, doing the work quietly, trusting the facts, that is its own form of strength, and it is teachable. It is learned. He learned it over decades of doing difficult things carefully. I've thought a lot about what I want Willa to carry forward from this. Not the injury, not the ugliness of what Darlene said or did. What I want her to carry is the memory of who she was in the aftermath, the fact that she was hurt and frightened, and she still chose honestly. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. Because here is what I believe, after 63 years, the people who do harm in this world are rarely punished by some outside force arriving to set things right. What actually happens, what happened with Darlene, is that they eventually meet the consequences of their own choices, and those consequences arrive in proportion to the record they've spent years building. The footage existed because Darlene came uninvited. Georgette had seen what she saw because Darlene couldn't keep her voice down. The paperwork existed because Darlene had never expected anyone to make one. She had counted her entire life on the graciousness of people she was trying to diminish. She had counted on Willa's kindness to cover her cruelty. And when Willa finally stopped covering it, there was nothing left to hide behind. The bare branches outside my window in November are not the end of anything. I know that now, the same way I know the repaired parts of that quilt are the strongest parts. Made twice. Stronger for it,